to, oh, there you go, recording's in progress. And in order to let the community know what floats their own particular academic boat. I think it's really, really important that a school is not just an examination delivery unit, it's actually a seat of learning, and that all of the staff have their own academic and aesthetic hinterlands. So I've spoken about a couple of mine. Miss O'Connell spoke about transgressive females in literature. David Godwin spoke about geopolitics and geostrategy. And we had Katrina McGrath talking about, is there an end to chemistry? So I'm delighted to introduce you to all, for those who haven't seen, Sarah Knight, who is our head of art. Evening, Sarah.
Good evening, everyone.
And Sarah is going to talk this evening about what floats her academic aesthetic boat, which is textiles and sustainability. What are the narratives of the fabrics we use? So, well, if it's anything to go by, if the opening slide's anything to go by, it's going to be a stimulating presentation. So, Sarah, what I'm going to do is to thank you in advance for what you're about to say. I'm going to invite you to go ahead, and if you do have any questions, ladies or gentlemen, along the way for when we get to the question and answer session later, I will mediate those questions myself and put them to Sarah, so please do put them into the chat function. I anticipate us finishing at some time before or at 7 o'clock. It's all pretty loose and cash. So Sarah, over to you, and thanks again.
Thank you, Paul. I would just like to say thank you to all, a massive thank you to all of you who are joining me today. I'm very thankful to have the opportunity to talk about something that is close to my heart. So I'd like to start by giving you a brief summary about why I care about the life of textiles, and more so the sustainability of textiles that we use. I actually studied textile design as my degree at Chelsea College of Arts about just over a decade ago, and at the time I went into it with a full passion of being creative and as inventive as possible, with a focus on creating beautiful textiles. That was my focus at the time, and the ways that I could manipulate and use the wide range of textiles available to me. I had no awareness at the time of how the fabrics I was using were actually produced, or what happened to them once they'd been bought and used by consumers. And my course and my tutors at the time fully supported my creative endeavours, and as a whole cohort actually of impressionable creators, we were able to push the boundaries of how we manipulated those fabrics. Then in my second year at Chelsea, something changed, and my university started to teach us about sustainability. I'd never even considered this. I never even thought about sustainability and where these fabrics or textiles came from. And at the same time, one of my tutors was writing a research page on sustainable textiles and how we could make the fashion industry just a little bit more sustainable. And Chelsea was investing lots of money into researching this, and so suddenly we were bombarded with lots of talks and discussions about sustainability. What did it mean? How were we using textiles? And this just completely blew my mind. At this point, I learned about the life cycle of textiles, which is sometimes referred to as cradle to grave. And I will talk about that in a bit more detail later. And began to question, actually, where was the fabric I was using to create my endeavours and coming from, and what happened to them afterwards. So we were at the time I was making samples for haute couture and high-end fashion, and then I started to think, actually, what happened to those textiles after they were bought and consumed and used? And in correlation, I think around that time there was also a focus on production. So what were big labels and brands like Primark and Nike doing to make sure that their textiles were sustainable? And it was really interesting. And I think now there is much more of a focus on this, and generally people care about what is happening with my fabrics and where do they come from. And I thought this is something that it's really good timing, and so I was really glad to be asked at this time to give this talk. So in the next slide and the next section, I'd just like to go over how I'm actually going to give this, because when I was thinking about it and milling it over, there's so many different aspects of sustainable textiles and where do fabrics come from, and I've tried to simplify it as much as I could into climate and impact of fashion, the overview of fabrics in clothing, production of fabrics. There's quite a few different fabrics as well, and then the life cycle and sustainability of textiles. Sorry. Okay. So to begin with, I'd like to discuss the climate impact of the fashion industry. I think that's a really good way of starting. I'm just trying to get this to work. Great. Okay. So here, a recent report by the United Nations Environmental Programme specifically looked at the fashion industry and its impact on climate change. It found that fashion is actually the second worst industry in terms of producing CO2. A single kilogram of textiles produces, on average, about 23 kilograms of greenhouse gases, and the textiles industry accounts for about 10% of CO2 emissions for a year. This is more than the aviation and shipping industry combined, which is just abominable. This means, in terms of your personal contribution to climate change, depending on obviously how much you travel, it's likely that your clothes are one of the largest sources of CO2, especially over the past few years when we haven't really been or traveling or had the opportunity to travel with COVID. That's just crazy. And the fashion industry also has an impact on the oceans, with about 8% of microplastics in the ocean thought to come from the fashion industry. These originate from synthetic fibres in clothing, which get broken down during washing and are carried into the drains and eventually out to sea. These synthetic fibres can remain in the ocean for very, very, very long periods. And unfortunately, that means they harm both plant and sea life. The fashion industry is also one of the major sources of water pollution globally, which I think sometimes is forgotten when we think about how are our fabrics produced, how are they then reused or upcycled. We don't really think about water pollution. And here you can see it uses huge quantities of water annually. These are 2 points which I would like to return to later in the talk, actually. Finally, it's worth trying to get a sense of the scale of the waste produced by the fashion industry. About 80 billion items of clothing are sold per year. And of this, it is horrifically estimated that about a half of these items will be thrown away within the first year. Like, a little bit, it makes me want to cry thinking about that. Just to give you a visual here, that's equivalent to one garbage truck's worth of clothing thrown out each second. So I don't know if you've ever been stuck behind a garbage truck in traffic. So one of those garbage trucks being thrown away each second. So it's a huge amount of waste that is created by the fashion industry each year. Okay, so now this is a good point to take a step back, thinking about how much is thrown away and how much the fashion industry actually is giving all of these types of pollution. Is just to consider actually some of the most common types of fabric, which I'm sure most of you will be aware of, that are used in today's fashion industry. Fabrics can normally be divided into two groups, natural textiles and synthetic textiles. So as a textile designer, that's what I would always have been thinking about: what's natural, what's synthetic, and what am I using at the moment. So natural textiles are those derived from animals and plants, and synthetic fibres are man-made. These normally involve things that are made from oil, if they're synthetic, or from byproducts of oil. Natural textiles are derived from animals and plants, and synthetic textiles are the ones that are man-made. Probably the most common natural textile used today is cotton, which grown on the cotton, which is grown on the cotton plant, and you can see this here in the image. It's actually quite beautiful looking at that. And it typically grows in very hot climates, which means also very dry climates. One thing that is distinct about cotton production is that it requires a huge amount of water. It also traditionally involved a huge amount of manual labour. However, now the picking is done using machines. That takes away the manual labour. The second most widely known fabric to be derived from a plant is linen, which is made from the flax part. And you can see that in the image on the slide here. A fun fact is that the UK is actually one of the major producers of linen, and the other type of natural fibre are those derived from animals. The one that first comes to mind for me is wool from sheep, which we traditionally get from sheep. Sorry, but it can also be from other animals such as llamas. The second type is silk, which comes from the silkworm. This is the caterpillar of the silk moth, and hopefully you can all see the image of the beautiful silk moth there. When the materials are harvested, the first thing that happens is that they come in these big clumps, and you can see it in the image there at the bottom. And then they are taken to be spun, which involves twisting it into forms of either thread or yarn, traditionally done by hand, like the image at the top, but now almost entirely automated. This is often broken down. Okay, so next I want to move on to the life cycle of sustainability and, oh, sorry, no, I don't. I want to move on to synthetic textiles before I get into sustainability. So the most common type of synthetic textile is seen in clothing. That's seen in clothing is polyester and also nylon. However, nylon is normally seen to a lesser extent. Both of these are made from oil, which means that they are essentially plastics. And that then means that they take a very, very, very long time to biodegrade if we're thinking about sustainability. Another common man-made fibre or fabric is elastane, which is sometimes referred to as spandex or lycra. And that is also formed from oil, unfortunately, with additional chemical processes. And this means that, well, obviously that's got its own climate and sustainable impacts as well that I'll come on to later. As the name suggests, this is very elastic, and therefore is often used in your garments that might have waistbands, or things like tights and other things like sportswear as well. It can also be interwoven into fabric to give the material a stretchy feel. For example, jeans are formed of a mixture of denim, which is made from cotton, and the elastane. And I'm actually going to touch on this later. So the next thing that I'd like to discuss is the cycle and sustainability of textiles. And this is my bit. This is the meaty bit. When we assess the sustainability of textiles, we normally refer to this as cradle to grave analysis that I mentioned before. This actually essentially tries to calculate the impact of a particular garment on the environment, right from the beginning of its production, so the cradle, to the final point at which it's either recycled or thrown away, and that is what we would refer to as the grave. And so cradle to grave. This is often broken down into 4 categories or stages. So you can see these on the slide. The first is the raw materials used in making or growing the fibres. So that's raw materials. The next is production. So that's production stages to convert the raw materials into an actual fabric. And then next is chemicals added. And finally, how the garment can be disposed of or recycled at the end of its life. So once we've bought it, what then happens to it after this? When we refer to sustainable textiles, which is what this talk is actually all about, we mean clothing that has a minimal impact on the environment in each of these categories, and that is how it's calculated. How sustainable something is what is the impact in each of these categories. So as an introduction to cradle to the grave, it's helpful to actually look at the CO2 emissions from a single pair of jeans. I mean, most of us have a pair of jeans, and I thought this would be an interesting study to look at. The data that I have up on the slide is from a 2015 report produced by Levi Strauss, and it estimates the CO2 emissions associated with each single stage of the life cycle of a typical pair of jeans. What I'm going to do is talk about them in the order they occur throughout the life cycle. So to start, we have the fibre, which is the actual growth of the cotton, and the harvesting. The emissions here come from the farm machinery used to pick the cotton, and that which is generally associated with running a farm, because it's not manually done so much. It's done by machinery now. Next, we have the fibre production, which is 27%. And this consists of the spinning to form the threads so that we can use that cotton to actually make a fabric, and the weaving to then convert the threads into sheets of denim fabric. This is actually about just over a quarter of the total CO2 emissions. And then the next stage involves cutting and sewing to convert the rolls of fabric into actual pairs of jeans. Next is the emissions associated with packaging. So actually, so this is printing the labels. I don't know if that's even ever thought about, when you think about the sustainability of a fabric. making the paper to print those labels, making the plastic tags that go onto those jeans, making the stickers that indicates the jean size, and so on. We then have the emissions that come from the transportation of the clothes from the factory to the consumer. There's loads and loads that I don't, I think we are all becoming more aware, but there's so many steps that sometimes they're not considered, unfortunately. The largest sector, accounting for over a third of the total emissions, is consumer care. So once we've actually bought it, then how do we care for our lovely pair of new jeans? Which refers to the washing and drying of jeans after they have been bought. This segment is probably the easiest to reduce, which is good to know. And we can do this by changing the frequency with which we wash a given garment, and the temperature we use when we do wash it. That doesn't mean that I am advocating all of you to wear dirty jeans all the time. Some internationals have actually found that in the UK, we tend to wash our jeans more often than other countries, but we tend to do so at a lower temperature. So this then mitigates the climate impact. So well done to us in the UK. The final stage is the end of life, which accounts for about 3% of the total and covers anything from about whether the garment was recycled or whether it went to a landfill. Okay, so this slide shows a similar graph, however, for the same report, but in this case, it's describing the water usage rather than CO2 throughout the life cycle of these jeans. A typical pair of jeans can require up to 10,000 litres of water to make. And just to give you a visual for that, that is enough drinking water for 10 people for a whole year, which is sad again. So you can see how the pie chart is a little simpler. And in this case, the vast majority of the water comes under fibre, 68%. And this represents the water used to grow the cotton. Again, just to remind you that cotton's grown in a high temperature climate that's very dry. So this takes huge amounts of water to help that cotton grow, and obviously this is a problem in that we are using up scarce water resources in really hot environments. Meanwhile, the fashion industry is still accelerating climate change, which leads to more frequent droughts in these regions as well, making water more of a scarce resource. And cotton needs all of this water, so it's really just exasperating the problem. So, just as a reminder, seeing as I went on a bit about those jeans, the 4 stages typically covered in the cradle to grave analysis of a garment are raw materials, production, chemicals added, and then the end of life. So I'm now going to talk to you briefly, try and make it as brief as possible, about each one. Synthetic materials are generally derived from oil, which is obviously a limited resource and has a well-known negative impact on the environment. Meanwhile, the use of silk and some other natural fabrics that involve animals is becoming increasingly less popular in recent years, particularly with the growth of the vegan movement. I don't know if we have anyone that's vegan joining us, but maybe you'll be able to add something extra to that, your thoughts on that. It is also important to consider the costs in terms of CO2 emissions and use of land and water resources that's associated with rearing materials, rearing animals like sheep. This may involve having grass fields instead of woodland, which can be used to capture CO2 from the atmosphere. Nevertheless, actually, wool remains considerably more sustainable than cotton, by giving what I've just discussed about the genes. I guess that's a good way to compare it. The third stage we mentioned was to do with the chemical treatments of the fabric. So the most common of these is the dyeing of the fabric. Although this is relatively small in terms of a concern, provided that the dye does not leak into waterways during production, which can sometimes happen. And I put a horrible image here where that is happening. Many clothes are advertised as being easy care or non-iron, which is great. We all say yay. And this just means that they have been chemically treated, actually, and often with formaldehyde. This can be harmful in high doses and is therefore regulated. Many clothes in particular, such as sportswear or work uniforms, are often treated with surface treatments. And this may make the clothes stain resistant or waterproof, but it's still chemicals. These are typically done by using chemicals called PFCs, which can actually accumulate within the body. And the long-term effects of these is unknown, but they are known to affect growth and also fertility growth. The environment and health effects of these chemicals can come either through accidental or deliberate spillages during production, or through leaking into the drainage system during washing at home, that we all do. You know, the former is more likely in developing countries where environmental regulations are weak or poorly enforced, and therefore they can get away with doing these things. The final step is therefore end of life. And in the UK, of the clothes that are thrown out, 80% is incinerated and the remaining 20% go to the landfill. Incineration is associated with obvious environmental damage, whereas landfill synthetic fibres can remain for extremely, extremely long periods without degrading. So one of the most common methods of disposing of clothes, other than throwing them away, is disposing to your local charity shop. And I'm sure many of us do this. So I've taken Oxfam as an example. Only about 1% of donations to Oxfam shops are actually resold in the UK, which, when I was researching this, is just so scary. And 35% are not of high enough quality to actually be resold, but are given to partners in Senegal or other countries, while the rest is actually recycled. So recycling is actually quite a labour-intensive job. When we all think like we're doing a great thing recycling our clothes, it's actually very labour-intensive, and it requires sorting by hand at the moment anyway. Sorry. This means that it's also quite an expensive job, as it is still done by hand. There have been some recent attempts to automate the process, although at the moment technology is still in its infancy, so it's still developing. Recycling textiles can also be very challenging if the textiles are of mixed materials. For example, in stretchy jeans, the elastane is woven into the denim, and this means it's really challenging to separate out and recycle both materials. The recycling process is typically performed by shredding material until it's composed of small scraps and fibre. which can then hopefully be respun into new thread or yarn. However, this shredding means, and you can see them being stacked there in the image, the shredding actually means that the new fibres are very, very small. In many cases, the shredded fibres are too short to actually then form a thread that is of sufficient quality to use. So for this reason, about 1% can be used to make new clothes from what you actually recycle. And instead they're used for lower grade products such as insulation in mattresses or stuffing your car upholstery. That's actually from recycled textiles, and this is what is referred to as downcycling. I don't know if any of you have seen this, but that is what downcycling means. Given the difficulty then in recycling clothes, in recent years, some other approaches have become increasingly more common. So one of these is the growing movement to rent clothes. I get lots and lots of adverts popping up when I go online of renting clothes. And this is starting to become more well known. A company that's just started doing it is called Rent the Runway, where the idea is that rather than buying clothes that would be worn very, very infrequently, you simply rent the clothes. And this means that you reduce the cost of production and raw materials. It can increase the costs associated, obviously, with transportation and washing. So for this reason, it's not suitable for regular visits, but can have a positive effect for clothes that would only be worn infrequently or for special occasions. And I've got a lot of recent pop-ups of do you want to rent this dress for a wedding occasion? So I don't know if they think I'm going to lots of weddings. There have also been some technological advances which hope to improve the recycling process. Levi recently collaborated with a tech startup called Avenue. It's spelt EVRNU, very clever, and it's pronounced Avenue. And they planned on creating a line of textiles which were manufactured from mostly recycled material. In the photo shown here, the jeans were actually made from cotton of taken from 5 shirts. So I feel like I've bombarded you with information. So just to wrap up, we can see that there are quite a large range of factors that affect sustainability, and actually it was really difficult when I started to think about what I wanted to include in the talk. Actually, there needs to be focal points, and there's so many things that could be talks in themselves. But these are the factors that really affect sustainability and the clothes that we wear. The material we use, or the material that was used, sorry, was it synthetic or natural? Did it involve very large amounts of water to grow the fibre? Is something that I would hope people start to think about. Was the material a mixture? So does that mean that the fabric cannot be recycled in the example that I gave you with the jeans? And where is it from? So this really affects the CO2 emissions that are associated with the transportation, but can also affect the local environment more directly. So was it made in regions where environmental regulations are maybe a bit lax? And the quality of the garment, this essentially means how long will you wear it? If we think back to how many items of clothing that actually when bought within a year, are then thrown or recycled. So a well-made mixed fabric item of clothing that lasts you a long time may be more sustainable than clothes that are more easily recycled, but may only last a few weeks or months. And I think that's something that I hope will be more of a focal point in news at the moment, like currently. And then there's the chemical processes done to the garment. The more dyes or treatments that have been added to the fabric, the more likely it is to have a negative effect on the water system. And finally, how we wash our clothes. This is not affected by the manufacture of the clothes, but instead a function of our behaviour, and can have a large impact on the overall CO2 emissions associated with our clothes. So just don't wash your clothes that often is what I'd like to say. And no one ever knows, I do it all the time. So I hope that, well, what I thought would be a short talk has demonstrated that the choices we make around sustainable fashion can have a huge impact on the environment, and it's not always that simple to determine which is the more sustainable or eco-friendly choices to make. I know that I struggle with that all the time. I think there is a great need for greater education in this area, and I'm hoping that maybe I've helped to educate some of you, so that we can start to make a positive and more sustainable choices about the fashion we wear. So I'd just like to say thank you so much for listening and joining me. That was really lovely to talk to you about something so close to my heart.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
I want to thank you, and I'm going to thank you properly at the end of this session.
Thank you.
We have had, I've had a
sorry.
major thought. So you talk about educating us, right?
Yes.
And you've educated me, and I'm going to talk about that when I thank you formally at the end.
Thank you.
For that, however, could I ask a couple of questions that have occurred to me, and to remind everyone that's logged on that please do feel free at this point to put in any questions that do occur to you into the chat, and I'll put them to Sarah. So the only two voices you'll hear with your ears will be me and Sarah, but of course any questions you have will be posed. My two questions, Sarah, are this. Is there any way, in terms of the recycling, is there any way, I suppose, procedurally of separating out the synthetic from the natural fabrics when you're recycling? So for example, you're talking about jeans, obviously got cotton, which is a natural fiber, but they've got that elastine, was it?
Yeah, elastane.
So is there any way of separating out methodologically the natural from the synthetic in the recycling process? It would be my first question.
That's a lovely question, thank you. I am just going to look back at my notes. So there are some ways, but they tend to be very slow. One company has recently started to try to use fungi. Fungi?
Mushrooms. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, to break down the natural fibers, which is quite exciting. Essentially, they let the fungus grow on the mixed fabrics, and then the fungus breaks down the natural fibers, which then takes out those natural fibers, leaving just synthetic. It's a really interesting idea, but it's at the moment it's quite slow, and obviously, well, not obviously, but it's very expensive, and it's not yet a practical way of recycling them.
Okay, thank you for that. And I'll tell you what, I'm going to hold my second question because some are coming through, so I'll kind of reserve it. So a question's come up, and it reads: Is it time to kill fast fashion?
Yes.
There you go. I was going to. Yeah.
Absolutely, completely, yes. And I think that's actually what was happening when I first started to care about this about 12 years ago, was that there were loads of at the time there were loads of news headlines about fast fashion, and I think slowly more things are becoming important. Yes, it's really important to care about to kill fast fashion. I was talking to another staff member in the playground today about this, and how, slowly people are starting to think, or definitely younger people are starting to think about, I want this piece to last, rather than I want this piece now and then I want a different piece next year. No, yeah, definitely. Thank you.
So no, because the question ends up with no more Primark, exclamation mark. So we will fully endorse that. Here's another one. Given that fashion is about change, and hence the fashion industry relies on cycles of change stimulated by marketing and the media.
Yes.
What do you see the future of this industry is, if we now know how damaging clothes buying is? So where are we going to be in, let's say, I don't know, 30 years, say, and that's a supplementary addition to that question.
I am hopeful that we will have more people caring about the sustainability of textiles, and more companies, because they are exposed now left, right and centre, and therefore I think the quality of the clothes that we buy will go up, and we will be influenced to care about those garments more so. There will be an increase in renting garments as well for special occasions, because that's really being pushed at the moment, and I can only see that going up, and the amount that we buy reducing. I think there will be a focus on quality, and hopefully prices therefore going up, and the amount that we buy decreasing, I think, and more smart textiles, things that react to the environment around us. I think I can see that becoming a common, rather than being used for just the army or specific jobs. I think that's gonna more of a common.
Thanks. And this is from your colleague Petica Watson, or
hello Petica, thank you.
This is our colleague. She asked, do you know of any particular slow fashion advocates in the world of fashion who are perceived as cool and trendy, basically? So we need the fast fashion. I know, what's her name, Molly May and all that lot. I mean, that's cool. No, I've got a 22-year-old daughter. So is there anyone in the world of slow fashion who's perceived as cool and trendy, as in other than, she writes, the people who run sewing classes encourage you to mend and repair? Because it's I see the thrust of Petica's question. There's no point with any of this unless people are going to decide that it's actually worth buying. So it can't be like macro grand's cardigan. No offense to the grandmothers out there.
Oh, Petica, I'm not going to say hello and thank you anymore, because that's a tricky question. I'm joking. I see a lot more of trade. That's the thing that comes to mind to me, is the shop trade. That is slow fashion. It's upcycling rather than recycling, and they are popping up everywhere, and it seems to be quite a common name that's known as well, even with our students, which is beautiful. Is that trade's known. I think there's actually one in Shepherd's Bush.
Okay, and here's my second question, and by the way, do feel free, anyone, to add any more questions, because if not, I'll wrap up after this, and if nothing else appears. This might sound like a stupid question, and I promise you it isn't, but you spoke about mixed fabrics again, or I did, where you spoke about it and asked a question. This sounds trivial, but I promise it's not. Sequins, right? When you get clothes with sequins on them, I now know, because you've opened my eyes, I now see nothing but vast amounts of bits of plastic, right? So I suppose the question is, how do you recycle the sequins on clothes? So, sorry about that if that sounds ridiculous.
No, that's a really good question. I have a lot of sequined garments that I don't wear to work, thankfully. But that's a really good question. So they're quite challenging in terms of recycling for a few reasons. the main one is that they're normally quite small, and they then need to be stripped out, which is really labour intensive. I don't know how many sequined garments you have, Paul, but they normally are quite small and sewn in individually, which is actually haute couture. It's quite labour intensive as well. So that can not really leave a lot of fabric, and can cause problems to recycle the actual cotton, or the polyester. Sometimes it's, well, normally it's on polyester, and there is more of a trend now, I believe, to make sequins from actual recycled fabrics. Actually, on that note, I'd just like to say we do have a student in our upper six looking at plastic waste and recycling, and looking into sequins, and that does reduce the environmental damage a bit, I guess. But yeah, they're quite labour intensive.
Thanks, Sarah. And in the absence of any more questions coming on the chat, I'd like to sort of wrap everything up and thank you formally, and to say pretty much what I've taken out of this. And I might even, at the end of this thanking session, get a little bit religious, and I'll explain what I mean. I'm a 56-year-old male. I take no interest in fashion, as you probably have noticed, and I have that. I am stunned by the amount of wastage entailed in the clothes that we wear. Stunned. I'm further stunned by the fact that, that, as you said, and if I've quoted you correctly, only 1% of the clothes that we virtuously send off to Oxfam or the Salvation Army shop or Cancer Research or whatever, which I do, only 1% of those get recycled into new clothes. I just assumed that they would all get reused and recycled. And I think that the likes of me, and therefore by extrapolation, the likes of us in the West, I'll put it bluntly, we've fallen prey to this lazy sense of virtue that when we separate out the plastics in our recycling from the envelopes in the junk mail and put it out, that we're obviously doing our bit for the environment. But in fact, to me, I'm wondering whether, based on what you're saying, it's a touch of a kind of a smoke screen, a CO2 screen, given that I'm a kind of a walking CO2 production unit. So in a sense, my eyes have been opened. And I want to thank you for your part in that process, because this is a bit where I will get faintly religious at this point, and to tie it in with the Catholic ethos of the school. And this is what struck me. In Luke's gospel, you get the parable of the rich man and Lazarus at the gates, which is, as listeners will recall, and you will see how I am going to move this back to irrelevant, by the way. I'm not going off on one. This is relevant. In which the rich man has the beggar Lazarus at his gates. And Lazarus is so poor that even the dogs come to lick his sores, and he doesn't even get a scrap to eat off the table. When the rich man dies, he goes to the underworld, and Lazarus is up in heaven, and he basically is very concerned about how he got there. And when I was younger, I always used to wonder what on earth that poor man was doing in hell, because he's really nice, because he keeps talking about, I want to come back to warn my brothers about this. Now, Lazarus is in heaven, the rich man is in hell, and I always wondered, well, what's he doing down there? Because he's clearly a nice man. He's clearly kind of ethical and wondering. And the reason he's down there, I've come to realize increasingly as time goes by, is that he is not down there because he's horrible to poor people. He's down there because his wealth is an insulating layer, meaning that when he was alive, he didn't even see the poor people, the poor person at his gate. It didn't register. He was insulated by his wealth. And I think that increasingly that life is about having our eyes opened to the insulating layer of the wealth around us, and that we can't just go patting ourselves as the back on as individuals, and we actually need to have our eyes opened more and more about how we are going around and affecting the poor and others. So that stuff about saying kind of offloading our stuff to Senegal, say.
Yeah.
Now, in other words, what I'm taking from this is I need to open my eyes more about what I am kind of producing. I just didn't know any of this.
Yeah.
My job is not to be like the rich man and to notice Lazarus. I didn't know any of this. And so I want to thank you for opening my eyes to this sort of stuff, and to, well, educating me, as you said, that was the aim to do at the end of your talk. So thank you for that. And sorry, listeners, I can see a lot of blank screens in front of. Don't go so loud. I promise you, I'm not going off on one. But I really do. Talks like this are really important. Oh look, there's.
I'm so sorry.
So it said that her daughter was going to.
That, yeah, that's Paul Stubbings, darling. Yeah. Say hello. Hello, Paul.
Hello there. Nice to see you.
Sorry.
No. Do you know what? She appeared at the right time. And so, Sarah, thank you. What a lovely way to end. And Sarah Dickinson, I've been told never to work with animals or children. So if you can log us off, Sarah, I really appreciate it. Lovely to talk to your daughter. And thank you for that talk. It was wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.